Ashish, you can start.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everyone. My name is Ashish Kela, BTech graduate from IIT Bombay 2006. Along with the amazing team at IIT Bombay Alumni Association, I will be your host this evening. Welcome to this talk. At the outset, right off the bat, please join me in welcoming Mitesh Shah. He co-founded Inflection Point Ventures in 2021 after leadership stints at Book My Show and Ola Cabs. He will offer a brief introduction of his team's investment journey in startups, and he is the partner for IIT Bombay Alumni Association in these series of talks. Over to you, Mitesh. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Ashish, and thanks for that introduction. Indeed, a pleasure to be here at this event with Dr. Acharya and the other dignitaries. So, quick intro: I'm Mitesh. I'm co-founder of Inflection Point Ventures, IPV, as we call it. We are one of India's largest angel fund. Right, started our journey back around COVID time, but last 4 years have been extremely, you know, learning, great insights into the startup ecosystem. So I think the ecosystem definitely holds a lot of promise. But when we started, there was a lot of FOMO based selling. The startup system was broken, where founders will have struggle getting money from angels. The process was very long, very tedious, totally broken chain, and most importantly, there was no help post investment. So at IPV, our core ethos is democratizing angel investment in the country. While we all see how public markets have been going, startup world have also seen been growing leaps and bounds. With the support of government and RBI itself and other regulatory agencies. In last 10 years, based on our experience, we have been contributing to this journey with my co-founders Vinay and Ankur. Right, as I said, we started in 2020, but we all come from operating background. With various stints at Ola, Book My Show. For Vinay, it was TPG, Unilever, Wildcraft, and Ankur has been an investment banker. So that's how we started, angel investing in our own individual capacity. We said probably we can add a lot of more value to the startup by coming together and forming a fund where CXOs like us can contribute not only capital, which is vital for the growth of the startup, but more than that, contributing through our expertise and connects, which help startups in multiple ways, even beyond capital, which is governance, opening up a lot of new markets, a lot of new ideas, and more importantly, connecting with VCs for the next round of funding, right? And for the investors, this meant that, people who are integral part of the ecosystem were driving the due diligence for them, presenting them, only the best of the ideas for investment. So today, we have in our journey of 4+ years, we have invested across 200 startups. We specialize in early stage investment, starting with pre-seed, going up to pre-series A, where the check size will be anywhere from 100K, which is 80 lakh, going up to $1 million. But sector agnostic, we have invested across sectors, right? We believe in backing great founders coming in at great valuations, right? That's the basic theme. And across sector, we have invested, fintech, health tech, deep tech, enterprise SaaS, and consumer, right? These are the preferred sectors that we have seen. With this focus on value addition to founders as well as investors both, where truly this is a fund for investors, of investors, by investors, we have been able to drive good growth for our startups, and in the process have been able to secure some great outcome for the investors as well. So like I said, for us the North Star metric always remains IRR of the total portfolio of 200 that we have invested so far. In a short span of 4 years, we have already secured about 45 exits, almost 16 full exits, and 29 optional exits, where investors have the option to pick and choose whether they want to exit based on the majority under AIF. And as many as 70 odd startups have gone for next round of funding as well, where they have been able to raise funding at a much higher IRR as compared to the value that at which we have invested. So we are dealing in an asset class where, unfortunately, the myth that goes around is that the success rate is only 10%. You invest in 10 startups and one or two will succeed, while 8 to 9 will fail. But we believe strongly that with active participation, with proper support to the founder, and with proper ecosystem, around this, the outcome can be materially different, as you know, this exit numbers itself prove. So almost 50% success rate that we have seen and continue to grow stronger. With the success of, you know, First Port Capital IPV, which is our angel fund, you know, the thesis that we have now gone ahead and established is that while these startups gone for their next round of funding, which is their growth requirement at Series A, Series B, we set up another VC fund called Physis Capital, which is a category 2 VC fund, typically where we'll fund the startups for their growth stage requirement. Since we know the startups, their journey, their execution skills, right, and the problem that they are solving, right, plus the governance as well. In while we have funded them through IPV, funding them through Physis becomes a lot more easier, where we have this unfair advantage of knowing them before and taking a bet on them, right, coming in at good valuation and again supporting them or continue to support them for further growth. So at the overall level, between IPV and Physis, we are able to fund the startup and help the founder in his journey right from the first check going up to Series B. And that's what the founders love about us, that it's not only a transactional journey. We continue to support the founder not only with capital but also with a lot of other value added support in the wake of their growth. And this is what IPV is all about. We have presence across Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore. Our investor base is again spread across all of India, and a lot of use of technology over here, where we have a full-fledged app, you know, and in web as well, right? But investors across the world, we have our investor base, mostly NRIs who, you know, invest on IPV in our deals, in our startups across 52 different countries, right? And this is purely because of the you know, the service that we provide them, and because of the finest of the quality of the startups that we bring to them. So largely through word of mouth, we have been able to establish a very strong network of investors across the world. Our next step is basically now setting up a Gift City fund also, as we look at tapping some interesting ideas outside India's as well as helping the NRIs and other you know, overseas investors to invest into Indian startup. But pretty excited to be part of this ecosystem. We strongly believe that, you know, with the current government and support of you know, able institutions like RBI, our ecosystem is very, very robust and still has a lot more growth to offer, right? And we believe you know, as angel, we also can offer a lot, and there is a lot to learn from this ecosystem, as well as in terms of wealth creation also. There are enormous amount of opportunity in this. I mean, you know, though this ecosystem has evolved over last 10 years, we strongly believe that we are still scratching the surface. You know, India overall will have just under 100,000 angel investors, right? And this number can grow multifold, as we have already seen, you know, in the recent past. That there are a lot and lot people who are excited about this and are continue to are actually curious to be part of this ecosystem, and not only contribute through wealth or capital, but also help in many other ways. And hence, we see a lot of strategic investors, corporate VCs, family offices, you know, now coming and forming, you know, part of our fund as well, and helping the startup ecosystem. So this is about IPV and you know, the setup that we have through Physis as well as IPV, where we help the startup and you know, proud to kind of support their journey. You have an opportunity to become part of IPV and this initiative, where you know, like we say, obviously wealth creation is important, but learning is more important. And startup ecosystem, you know, learning the overall business, the way these youngsters kind of think about business, that's the most exciting part of our overall journey. So be part of us, right? And would love to guide you through this, and again learn in the process also from you. So here we are. Thank you so much. Thanks for this opportunity, Ashish and IIT BA. Thanks, Dr. Acharya. Look forward to the session in detail. I'm around if there are any further questions. Would love to answer them.
Thank you, Mitesh. That was brief, succinct, and to the point. Much appreciate your focus on timeliness and helping us get a glimpse of what's really, you know, happening under the hood at IPV. Now, once again, without much ado, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all the viewers. Please join me in welcoming our fellow IIT Bombay alum and Mumbai's Mulga, Viral Acharya. Most of you are joining me late on Saturday monsoon evening, and I'm sure you're already aware of all the amazing accomplishments and are in awe of his work in finance and central banking. Sadly, we have Viral for a very limited time. So my introduction will be slightly different. I reached out to many of his batchmates and peers. And one thing stood out. Everybody said one thing, which is a common theme across board. He gets it done. And also, बहुत serious बंदा है. When he applies his mind to something, he just does not sort of deviate and always manages to find success at the end of it. Be it inflation targeting for the largest democracy in the country, or learning to sing as a gift to some of his wing seniors before Wolfie, he gets it done. It took him a few weeks to sort of become a proper singer, and he went on to actually launch his own album. He also painted during his time at IIT Bombay. My 3-minute extensive search showed that he's the only institute topper, gold medalist, to sing and paint during his time at IIT. I don't know of anybody else across all IITs. Sadly, my YouTube searches for viral songs and viral Acharya songs were not very successful. So he will only sing if the audience demands it at the end of this talk. Not one to rest on his laurels. His peers and friends across countries and continents continue to rate him very high on diligence and academic research quality. Only his wingmates and maybe during one off conversation with Sanjeev Sanyal was humor mentioned along with Viral's name. So please join me in welcoming the Bahut Serious Banda with the widest grin ever recorded on live screen. Please join us with smiling face, Viral Acharya.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashish. That's like very, very generous introduction. I'm so glad that my friends think well of me. It's a big relief. But I think if you had told them that you're not going to publicly relay the comments, then you might have heard some very different things from my big mates, at least. Some of them I met in New York City yesterday, and we had some good laughs actually over dinner last night. So very delighted to be here. Thank you to all of you who've taken out time, especially in India on a Saturday evening. To all the dignitaries, to the excellent introduction that Mitesh provided us for all the wonderful things that are happening in the Indian tech and non-tech but startup ecosystem. I'm sure we'll touch a lot more on that. But it's always a great pleasure to be here. When I was in Reserve Bank of India, I was making far more regular trips to IIT Bombay. My mentor in economics at IIT Bombay, Professor Pushpa Trivedi, was still at IIT Bombay at that time. So I used to visit the economics and humanities department for talks and interactions far more regularly. She's now at Shiv Nadar Institute. She's retired now. But IIT was important to me, not just for tech, but actually in also deflecting me towards economics and finance through my course with Professor Pushpa Trivedi. So to her and IIT Bombay, I'm always very, very grateful.
Brilliant. Thank you for joining us, Viral, this evening and morning for you. Much appreciated. Viral and I discussed this in advance, and we thought sort of to keep it crisp and maybe focused on some key bullet points that Viral thought were key and we were curious about. So starting off, Viral, can we just have maybe 3 highlights from your time at IIT? Anything that stood out over time has been a part of your memory, or even if you have some anecdotes that deserve to be recorded for posterity, we would be very keen to hear them.
Yeah. So, of course, first and foremost, I would say it goes without saying that what's really special about IIT is the screening process and the peers who come in as a result of that. And there's just something, I didn't appreciate this when I was in India, that these entrance exams, their integrity, their quality, the sheer amount of work that you put in while preparing for these entrance exams is actually such an important process that all the smart folks in India who put together these institutions in 50s and 60s thought about. But the level of screening and the work ethic that it creates in you along the way is in itself I almost feel like even when you enter IIT, you've sort of already made such important strides unknowingly towards actually shaping your future, preparing for the exam and so on. So I think I was particularly lucky in my batch in the sense that there were just so many bright minds around me, in electrical engineering and computer science. They've all gone on actually to become some of the world's highest regarded researchers in both electrical and computer science. I was sort of closer with that group of friends because they were also with me in Ruparel College in Mumbai. And I think even though I'm not in the field with them, I should say, thankfully, I'm not in the field with them. I'm in a different field than these really smart folks. But I think what was extraordinary was to see, the way they were thinking about problem solving, the way they were always organizing all the material and syllabus, not into how to prepare for the exam, but how to think. What's a set of problems in computer science and which can be solved with which method. And so, their thinking was like at a meta level higher than actually just preparing for the courses and exams. And I think to me, that was just sort of awe-inspiring, when I looked at some of these guys. And I always felt like hats off to the screening system that it's actually able to identify these brains and get them into IIT. So I would say to me, that was sort of like number one. I think the number two high point for me was, I think I was a bit nerdy when I joined IIT. All along I'd just done academics, etc. But IIT was the real place where I got to discover myself, not just as an academic or as a student of subjects, but more as an individual, as a personality, in terms of hobbies and interests, and, developing a little bit more of a well-rounded character rather than just sort of being good at taking tests and so on. And I think that was just enormous. I think you mentioned a couple of things. I think to me, singing and sports were a very big part of it. But I think I also had a lot of opportunities to do, I would say, like minor. I wasn't sort of a hostel secchi or a institute-wide secchi, but I was doing a few things for the computer science department. We were developing a magazine called Tech Fest, and I was taking a lot of leadership in that. And so I think I would say that giving a person a better understanding of who they are, and I think the undergrad dorms and your experiences there really bring that out in you. And I think I'll be forever grateful for helping me find myself, even if it meant that at the end of 4 years, I ended up with the realization that perhaps I didn't want to do computer science, but that's okay. I think it's more important that you find your real calling rather than keep doing whatever you've been doing. And third and foremost, I would say, to me, the Sur Bahars in which we sang in IIT Bombay, to me, like that was like the most satisfying experience. There's just something electrifying about being on stage. Of course, by no stretch, I'm a professional singer, but the moment you are on stage, the mic is in your hand, there's a band behind you. I'm telling you, everyone starts thinking they are Kishore Kumar. So I think it was a great feeling. I think the fact that my wing in Hostel 6 had such amazing singers. I didn't even sing when I joined IIT, as you pointed out, but I think observing them, learning from them, getting inspired by them, I started then practicing and getting onto stage. And, it's just something very, very special. And then I continued that. I formed a band also called Sur Bahar at NYU with Indian PhD students. We used to sing with bands in New York, New Jersey, sometimes in Philadelphia, Connecticut. And what was sort of very nice about that singing experience was that it actually introduced me to this education charity in India called Pratham, with which I've been now associated for more than 25 years. In fact, we founded Pratham's chapter in New York, then in London. My wife and I and some other volunteers were involved. And actually, now I'm sort of more into the education charity than the singing part, which I'm not doing on an active basis anymore. But it was funny why I why I got introduced to that. So we were forming this band at NYU called Surbar, and we said, why would anyone pay, or even if we paid them, why would they come into the auditorium to listen to a bunch of folks like us? So then one of the volunteers came up with this idea, like, why don't you sing for a good cause? And maybe then, even if you are unknowns, even if the show is not of the highest quality, people will at least walk out with a good feeling that they bought the tickets. I mean, the money is going for a good cause. And then Dr. Madhav Chavan, who was the co-founder of Pratham in India, was visiting New York, New Jersey at that time. So we got introduced to him. And then we sang our very first concert itself for Pratham. And so, but what I'm trying to say is that sometimes we think about these educational institutions in a very narrow academic sense, producing engineers or producing technocrats. But it's really the fullness of that experience. And to me, it has led to just so many forks and branches in my life at different points of time that it's hard at some point to not to lose that identity of being an IITian from you, because you are forever going to be that imprint of being at IIT, and in my case IIT Bombay is always going to be like a big rubber stamp on your CV. But it's beyond that, because it's actually like a very deep foundation of your life. So I would say, to me, these are some of the highlights, which is that it keeps affecting me sort of in ways that I had never imagined it would, because it's beyond the subject matter, it's beyond the immediate friends, it's beyond the immediate experiences. It's almost at a very deep subconscious level in my case. Yeah.
Amazing. You mentioned that, Viral, the fullness of the experience. So somebody, was talking to me, and I was just calling it, Bachelor of Technology in Confidence is all I have. Sadly, I don't remember any of my lessons, but that's what I picked up at IIT, and that's what has sort of helped me do whatever I did after IIT. You also promised us an anecdote, so I would like to offer you this opportunity one more time. I do have some stories, but as you already know, I don't have the liberty to share them. If you want to share any stories or anything that you remember, I'm sure all the audience is very keen to know how it was between 91 and 95 on the campus.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to remember what was let me just mention one incident, which is that you mentioned a little bit about doing things on the fly, like learning to sing for my wingmates' farewell, because they were all such fabulous singers. In fact, one of the friends I met last night in New York City is one of them, who's an amazing singer. But there was one other challenge we had at IIT Bombay. So I had never participated in like elocution or any such thing, but our hostel was very strong in English literature. One other person I met from our batch about a week back, Prashant Murthy, we used to call him Stuff because he was the real stuff. He kind of came to IIT Bombay knowing like almost anything that was to be known in terms of general knowledge. His English was fantastic. His IQ was very, very high. His vocabulary and the way he spoke and everything was awesome. So anyway, Stuff was sort of leading the charge for Hostel 6 to win the sort of literary prize in the intra-hostel competition. But we were like 1 or 2 points or something like that short. I don't remember the exact points, whether it was points or exact golds or whatever. And so we came up with this unique idea that no one does Hindi elocution. So barely so of course, literary prize was not just for English, it was also for Hindi. But there would be no competitors in that space at all, zero. Like maybe one guy would show up or two guys at best. So we looked carefully at the participation in the initial rounds, and we figured that this is a gold mine. My Hindi was always decent, being from Bombay and having taken my Hindi courses sort of very, very seriously to ace the 10th exams and all that. And, I'd always listened to a lot of music, and I was a big movie buff all through my childhood. So just through learning Hindi from what was spoken on the screen, reading a little bit of the literature, etc., my Hindi was both sort of well grounded, but not just in terms of grammar, but also I was sort of, in terms of Hindi literature, I was reasonably well versed. And so we came up with this idea that, okay, we'll put me in every single Hindi elocution for poetry, for like, reading passages from literary books, etc. out there. I had never done anything like this before. So, like a typical cramming for the exam on the last day, we started preparing. And then I had this one audio tape where I think it was called Bachchan Recites Bachchan. So it was Amitabh Bachchan reciting poetry of Dr. Harivansh Rai Bachchan. And there were some real masterpieces of both poetry and elocution there. And I remember sort of like memorizing all of this. And as I said, like, once you are put in front of people and given a podium to speak, you start thinking you are bigger than who you are. So at that moment, you start thinking, oh, I'm actually the one who is supposed to be doing this elocution of Dr. Harivansh Rai Bachchan's poetry. But some of them were so powerful, actually. But again, I'm just to weave it into my earlier thought. That was actually my deeper introduction to his poetry. And to date, I find sometimes, when I want to be inspired, I still go back to some of that poetry and I still read it. So, but I think it was a very classic IITian Jugaad solution to Hostel 6 winning the literary prize by nominating me in a category where there were absolutely no. So I think in the Hindi poetry recital, I was the only participant. So of course I won the gold. And we just beat whichever the next hostel was in the literary prize by doing that. So I thought it was a fun set of memory that stayed with me after that.
Amazing. So good to know that what you remember from your IT days, how you gamed the system. So that's great. So Viril comes from a family of medical professionals. So I'm sure his doctorate was not a surprise to anybody in his family. And but thankfully for me as a finance market professional, Viril switched from theoretical computer science to economics and especially with a focus on finance very early on. What that also meant was a lot of Viril's work is actually based on actual data, empirical evidences rather than purely theories. And I'm sure given your the academic profile in IIT, focus on theory and doing so well in computer science, pursuing a PhD in theoretical computer science, but then moving away from all of that and getting your eyes or sort of lens focused on data very, very early on. I'm talking about, so he earned his PhD in 2001. So before that, he sort of started looking at data. I'm sure that actually helped in two ways. One is you are not a normal economist, and they've been facing a lot of flack in the last few decades for their forecasts. Your work has always been around data, and nobody can shy away from looking at the sort of conclusions that you have arrived at and research that you have done. Any thoughts on that? How that transition played out, and what was the thought process there? Was it just luck, or did you have some basic inclination towards a particular direction versus the other?
Yeah, I think so. The stuff we were doing in computer science was very exciting. I was doing more theoretical computer science, sort of, graph theory, computational complexity of algorithms and stuff like that. At some point in my third or fourth year, I felt that maybe my aptitude for this was not as high as I might have thought. Perhaps if I had done systems engineering or databases or something like that, maybe I would have even stayed back in computer science. Maybe I was more suited for that. But whatever it was, I chose to pursue the theoretical line. And then at some point I said, maybe this is not the right thing to do. I'd already applied to universities abroad. But then I ran into a friend of mine, was also a family friend of ours, actually, Dr. Apurva Koticha. He had completed his PhD at NYU in finance. He had come to the US, then done an MBA and then done a PhD, and then I got to know him. He had actually become a star trader, I think, at Citibank, Solomon Smith Barney at that time. And I spoke to him. He said, finance economics is a very interesting field. I had already taken Professor Pushpa Trivedi's class in international finance and trade. There's something I liked a lot about that initial coursework, that his idea that a central bank being like an institution at the center of the economy, by just like changing the dial of interest rates or the amount of liquidity that it's supplying in an economy, can actually change the outcomes of an economy, can change the way households are consuming, change the way corporates are investing. If you're a large central bank like of United States, you change things not only in your own country, but you're actually changing global trade, investment, and consumption outcomes the world over. So there was something very fascinating and intriguing about that, which is that how are the financial flows and the plumbing organized so that one institution sitting, not even an institution, is actually a bunch of governors or deputy governors who are on the monetary policy committee. How are they making the world sort of move through the dial that they just turned by like 25 basis points, 0.25% or 0.5%? Why do they have such a disproportionately large impact through a very small decision that they are undertaking? So it kind of fascinated me, it intrigued me, I wanted to learn more. And then my family friend convinced me that finance was both analytically and empirically, as you pointed out. If you wanted to just work with data, that it had a very tangible feel to it. That I could see already from my coursework, that you would be studying households, you would be studying corporations, you would be studying why people become employed or unemployed, why their salaries are growing or not growing, why are some countries so rich in a per capita sense, why are other countries so poor. So then I decided to do it. And to be frank, when I joined the PhD program in finance, I really wanted to be on Wall Street. I thought that I would be, working for a large bank. So for 3 summers in a row, I worked at JP Morgan as a summer intern in derivatives research. It was very cutting edge work. I loved it, but I didn't like the lifestyle. I think I felt that it was a little bit of a black hole, in terms of sucking you in and like getting the best out of you. But I felt at the end of each summer that I was a bit sapped and depleted in terms of my mental effervescence, if I could use that word, which is like you want to be like brimming with ideas, not be like drained out completely at the end of these experiences. And so the work was very fascinating while you were on the job, but when I left the jobs, I felt this is not the lifestyle I want. I want to be a little bit more of a free-spirited individual in terms of having all the freedom to work on issues I want to study. But those internships were very crucial in shaping my thinking, because in 97, 98, we had the Southeast Asian crisis. So the Southeast Asian tigers had started slowing down. They had a external sector and currency depreciation episodes. Then Russia defaulted in summer of 98 on its debt. There was a big hedge fund in New York City, long-term capital management, about $125 billion in size, that was about to fold up and sort of had to be rescued through a coordinated attempt by the Fed and the other banks that were exposed to the hedge fund. And that was the time I realized that maybe it's financial crises where you can actually understand why the central banks can play such a big role. Why are they so important? It's kind of a little bit like we use the term plumbing of the financial sector. Like that's the term that used a lot, financial plumbing. And I think it's a very accurate way of discussing it, because what's a key characteristic of plumbing is that on a day-to-day basis, you assume that the plumbing works. You open the tap. No one is asking the question, oh, which part of the plumbing is going through my tap, to which part of the building, to which part of the city, to which water reservoir, and so on. But it's the day that your tap doesn't give you the water that you start asking that question. And I think there's something similar, I would say, about central banks and the financial plumbing, which is that everyone on a day-to-day basis assumes it as given. When we invest in the stock market or in new companies, as Mitesh was telling us, you don't ask the question, how is the money flowing in the world? How is the money reaching the Indian shores? How is it coming from the Indian pipes into the angel funds or VCs? How is it then going into the pipes of the companies? You just, when the liquidity is flowing, the money is flowing, you just take as given that the plumbing is there, it's working well. And I would say that's partly its job. Maybe it's not very different than actually the flow of blood in our own body. On a normal day, when everything is working fine, we don't ask the question, oh, whether my arteries are working fine and which artery is carrying how much blood to which part of the body. But the day something goes wrong, you start asking this question. Someone has to investigate which arteries are not flowing well. It's the same way in financial plumbing. When a financial crisis occurs, you start asking the question, oh, which pipes are working in the economy and which pipes are not working? Why are banks sometimes in good health, not in good health? If banks are not in good health, which pipes get clogged? How can the central bank unclog some of these pipes to get money flowing back into different parts of the economy? So that was a very fascinating experience. But I agree with you that for me, the key aspect of research that I like in economics and finance are two. Well, maybe three, if I could say. One is that what you already mentioned, which is that in my research, at least, I do both theory and empirical work. So there's a constant feedback between my models and the data work. So I develop models, I realize, then I try to test them. I realize they are not actually good enough to explain everything, or maybe they're not even right. And then I go back and try to improve them in the next generation of models. Second, I would say I like the fact that a lot of finance and economics is ultimately touching the human beings very directly. Now, to be fair, if I had been doing computer science, which was a little more applied, perhaps I would have had that feeling as well. But at least with the theoretical stuff I was doing, I didn't have as much of a tangible feel as to how what I'm working on is going to affect the common man. To me, somehow it's very important. I want to be able to understand how whatever you're doing ultimately matters on the ground at the last mile, be it a small entrepreneur, be it a household, be it a corporation. Um, and there's something sort of nice about being able to establish that link from all the way from a central bank office to the last mile, of a walk along an alley or a street in Mumbai, for example. And third, I would say what I like is there's a slight difference in my view in the research in technical sectors and research in economics and finance, which is that in a lot of technical sectors, very often the problems are sort of specified, and very often it's about solving them faster or figuring out the algorithm to solve the problem. So the problem solving aspect in computer science, at least when I was doing it, was very much the problems were there and you had to figure out the solutions. Whereas a lot of time in economics and finance, I feel you are actually defining the problems themselves. Because human beings are very complex. Financial sector, therefore, is not static. It's always organically evolving because human behavior keeps evolving, policy keeps evolving. In response to policy, different institutions are evolving their behavior in financial sector, in corporations, in households. And so you have to keep redefining and re-specifying the problems. And so a lot of creativity in finance and economics is not about actually problem solving, but it's about asking the right questions. Now, I may be overstating this difference, but at least my switch from computer science to economics and finance had a very clear shift in this direction. And I felt that my relative advantage was in actually asking the right questions rather than necessarily figuring out in a technical sense what's the solution to that problem. But I personally enjoy that aspect a lot, that you are sort of asking questions, asking new questions, building new models, throwing new light on how to connect different dots of what is otherwise a very complex global economy to understand.
Amazing you say that, the focus is so much more on, drafting the question, right? Because I see your latest sort of, area of focus is climate finance and climate related risks right now. And I think you're completely on dot there. We are doing such a poor job there in terms of just, crafting the question. We don't even know what to look for and what to measure. So keenly looking forward to sort of, what you can sort of what you'll produce there and what kind of research you'll sort of be sharing on that front. Thinking about your work on climate risk, I also had this thought that it's almost maybe 5 years and 4 days or 3 days since you quit as the deputy governor at RBI and moved back after a very successful stint, I would like to think. In sort of during a transition phase at RBI where new models and new thought process was actually being instilled in the entire ecosystem. So I think you played a key role in that entire transition. But I think you can also claim, or lay sort of claim to another point, which is, brain drain from India. You double dipped in that trade. How you did it was you got your BTech, and obviously you did what you did after that. But you came back to India, became a deputy governor, and then again went back from India to help the central banks in the US and Sweden. So I think you're one of the few people who's double dipped in this, brain drain trade, where maybe you picked up something in India during your experience and then, have applied it globally. Stretching that line of thought, maybe, and I, by the way, heard from a lot of, people during private conversations, you've always highlighted and thought very highly of the processes and governance at RBI in general as an institution. So that's been brought to my attention. But you also, transitioned out in a particular fashion, which, had a lot of focus during that point in time. So I'm aware we'll probably, there's a very high chance we'll see you back in India in that building very soon. And look forward to that. But then that said, maybe you got an opportunity to learn a lot of finance, economics, come back to India and then apply that in India for 5 years as a deputy governor, for a long stint as a deputy governor. Maybe what you learned about India using the data models, if you could highlight maybe three, specific points that, sort of came back to you from the data that you were studying as a deputy governor, and what does that India story really mean to you when you look at it from a deputy governor's lens?
Yeah, no, I think you've actually touched upon something quite important, if I could start with that, which is that, in my view, like people like me who have an emerging market upbringing, an emerging market grounding, I would like to think perhaps some understanding of emerging markets as a whole as well, in spite of having spent maybe about half of my life abroad now. That my sense is people who have these sorts of background are going to become very important probably in finance and economics over the next 20, 30 years. Because if you look at the long stretch of time, especially over the last 2 to 3 decades, in a way you could argue that there were sleeping giants like China and India that were basically not growing at all, for big parts of the early 20th century, 19th century, and so on. And all this changed in the second half of the 20th century. In case of India, in 90s, in case of China, a little bit earlier. And it's like a very slow shifting sand. It's almost like tectonic plates are sort of moving underneath the surface of the global economy. And simultaneously, while the growth rates in these sort of demographic giants is rising, perhaps partly because of that, partly because of some policy errors at their own end, the growth in the West is generally sort of slowing down maybe really some countries like United States have done better than others. But as a whole, I'm saying developed world as a whole is facing headwinds to growth, headwinds to policy making, headwinds to government borrowing capacity that we had kind of unheard of in most of the 20th century, barring perhaps the Great Depression. So in some ways, what happens is when growth slows down, my simple view is that there is no such thing as like a truly like a developed market, a developing market, a low developed country. It's better to think of them over time, which is that a country's characteristics can change and they may start behaving more like an emerging market in a decade, even though technically we think of them as a developed country on the basis of their per capita GDP. On the other hand, something that looks like an emerging market on a per capita GDP because of the policy measures and the unleashing of growth that is happening there, they might actually be punching weight way above an emerging market and actually acting more like a developed economy. And I think it's important to keep that in mind and not think about countries in these buckets of advanced economies, emerging market economies. And my view is that when growth slows down, policy mix invariably becomes one where politics starts getting a bigger role, populism starts taking over, government deficits and debts start expanding because politicians have to show their population and their voters that, listen, we are doing whatever we can to keep the growth resurrected and higher. And therefore, I feel that in advanced economies where growth has slowed down for several decades, and now they are actually, the populism is manifesting itself very evidently in their government debt to GDP numbers, in the deficit numbers. Social safety nets are sort of reaching the boundaries of what the governments can do to actually compensate for the lack of high growth in these economies. That in a way, their constellation of macroeconomic parameters is beginning to now, to me, look closer to what I would think would apply to an emerging market. Now, okay, they have higher per capita GDP, so they can actually withstand economic distress or lack of growth for a longer period of time than an emerging market at a lower per capita GDP can. But I think the policy mix, the policy trade-offs, the pressure that is coming on central banks in these countries to actually keep the government costs of borrowing low, sometimes disregard inflationary impulses because you want to keep interest rates low to help the government tide over its rising debt burden. 30 years back, you would have said, oh, these kinds of problems only happen in India. I'm just sort of using India as just as a metaphor for emerging markets. But today, these problems are now happening all over the world. And so, therefore, I think as time goes by, people who have dealt with these challenges, people who have seen how you navigate these policy trade-offs, when do you stand your ground, when do you strike compromises, what is the difficult balancing act that you have to perform while doing this? I think people who have this experience, in my view, will become more valuable to the global policy mix as time goes by. So anyway, that's a very long, I would say, first point, which is how Indian experience could actually be relevant for the world. What I learned about India then is a bit related, which is just like US, India also has a little bit of a syndrome of Indian exceptionalism. We like to think somehow we are special, we are different than the rest of the world. And I sort of question that in the US, I question that in India. Listen, it's like everyone's responding to a set of constraints and a set of factors. There's some institutional backdrop which is very crucial. So Francis Fukuyama and Acemoglu and Robinson, these economists have explained that what seems to be a constant in explaining economic outcomes across countries is what's the quality of your institutions. Do you have a rule of law? Do you have a judiciary that's taking decisions the right way? Do you have a central bank that's functioning more or less in an autonomous or independent manner, or it's constantly under political pressure? How many of the executive arms of the government are given sort of independent operating powers versus them essentially all serving only the current party or the administration rather than actually thinking about the long run of the economy, etc. That these are, sort of broader, are contracts enforceable in the bankruptcy courts, etc. Like these are the institutions that are sort of constant in helping understand why some countries are Denmark per capita GDP and why some are much lower. But otherwise, everyone is responding to a set of constraints, a set of macroeconomic outcomes. Of course, every country is making its choices. But to me, the fact that I was able to use my academic learning about banking sector problems in the rest of the world, in Japan, in Europe, in US, and apply it when I came to India to the Indian banking sector problem, which I was studying from outside, but I wasn't studying Indian banks when I was in India. To me, that was a sign that actually there is some, just like the laws of physics, there's something in laws of finance and economics that applies in a uniform way, including to India, including to the United States, and so on. There's some exceptionalism, but one can very easily overstate, I think, the importance of that exceptionalism. So it's good to keep that in mind that we can learn from other countries, and at the same time, the Indian experiences can actually help other countries learn about their policy challenges as well. The third thing that I learned about India, which I still believe is true, is that the Indian consumer, the Indian household, an Indian individual, we are super economists at a very micro level. We are like super optimizers. Like maybe it's the way our economy is structured, like maybe not the most current generation, but most generations before, we lived in a shortage economy. We had very high inflation numbers until the last decade. We didn't have like great abundance of wealth even today, barring like the very top wealth in India. Per capita GDP is still very low, so everyone is super optimizing, and I just love that when I see the Indian households, that they are very price sensitive. They keep the products and the product developers, the companies always on a tight leash because they'll very quickly respond. The day your delivery is not in time, they'll switch to another app. The day the food from a restaurant is not of the quality you desired, you will switch to another restaurant. And so at Reserve Bank of India, I always told everyone, like, don't ignore what the Indian consumer is thinking. Don't joke about Indian households' expectations about inflation. That my mom, I used to give this example and I used to call it the Pav Bhaji index. That sort of like something became commonly associated with me. Just that I always used to ask my mom, do you think the cost of peas, tomatoes, and onions is going up or going down? And I used to call it like, if we had to make pav bhaji for me, do you think it's become more expensive or it's become less expensive? And without knowing anything about inflation, I used to find that her accuracy in telling me how food inflation in India was going to move was so much better than anything else that I could look at. So there's something about the behavior of Indian consumer, households, individuals, that even if you don't have to be an economist, you just have to be an optimizer. You're just solving problems subject to your constraints. Typically in India, that means a tight budget constraint. You're optimizing your consumption basket, your purchases, which consumers, which products to buy, etc. And it's so efficient that in a way, it sort of gives it gives the sense that, and that is actually why it works, because when a central bank turns the dial of the interest rate and makes it cheaper for the households and companies to borrow, what's the assumption? The assumption is that this is going to transmit to the real economy. That's the term the economists like to use. It's the transmission of the monetary policy. So that transmission assumes that someone who's touched by my changing the knob of interest rate inside the central bank is going to respond the very next day and alter their investment decision, alter their financing decisions. And the Indian household is like super nimble in doing this. In fact, I would say the Indian household is far more nimble than the Indian corporations and the Indian banks, because partly there we still have a very high imprint of state-owned banks, state-owned enterprises. They are not as nimble because they're not under as much pressure. Whether they do well or don't do as well, there's a sort of soft government budget constraint that they face. The government will do some transfers across ministries or transfers across these enterprises. And so to me, that was sort of very, very reassuring about the Indian economy, because it says that when you allow the Indian economy to function based on its own instincts, based on its own optimization, without an overbearing level of influence of having too many state-owned enterprises, etc., that we can be as efficient as any other economy out there, because the core instinct of the Indian consumer is to actually super optimize, be super efficient in dealing with your own budget constraints.
Thank you for those insights, Viral. Just touching on another thought, from your experience at RBI, you had record dividends, sort of come out of RBI for the government, and obviously we've had, a lot of research also highlighted, in terms of does it make sense, does it not make sense, and so on. More than the research aspect, which can be sort of numbers can be worked around. I'm more keen to know, sitting in US right now, maybe a very short answer in terms of, how is the world looking at that right now? You already highlighted research that showcases that the quality of institutions differentiates the long-term uh, path of any economy. Just maybe a short answer on these RBI dividends. Is there
Yeah, I'll
any
just
thought
give,
possibility?
I'll explain it very simply. I don't want to get into the specific numbers, but
Yeah.
see, the US Federal Reserve, whatever profits they make, at the end of each week, they are transferred to the US Treasury. Now,
Wow. Okay.
why do they do that? My interpretation is that it's because US is a very high rated economy in terms of credit quality of the sovereign. So if tomorrow anyone asks a question about what is the counterparty risk of Federal Reserve, it's going to be the same as the counterparty risk of the United States government, because US government can recapitalize the central bank balance sheet through a taxpayer money injection if they want. And so the Fed doesn't have to worry about its own balance sheet strength. Dollar is also the reserve currency of the world. So it's not like a dollar is going to go in a tizzy if there is a risk aversion in the rest of the world. If anything, dollar appreciates rather than depreciating when there is too much uncertainty in the rest of the world. Neither of these applies to India. One, while our sovereign credit quality has remained steady, maybe even improving somewhat, we are still at the cusp of investment grade. We are basically just one notch above the investment grade category. And the Reserve Bank of India, when there is a currency depreciation, ideally should be perceived by counterparties as actually of AAA rated quality. So even though the sovereign that is backing you is of BBB rated quality, you want that the central bank of the country, it's sort of like, think about it as like Shivaji's fortress.
Yeah.
Like, okay, Shivaji is ruling over all of Maharashtra, and there are parts of Maharashtra that are vulnerable to attack, say, from the enemy. But his prime defense is the fortress, and this fortress should not get touched by an enemy invasion, even if they have started attacking the villages at the foothills. So the central bank, in my view, should be perched on such a high hill, away from what's the average quality of you getting attacked by an invasion by the enemy, which in this case is a currency depreciation or in foreign investors pulling out money from you, etc. So the reason why RBI has to shore up its balance sheet by retaining profits is because India is not yet or not a AAA rated country. So for RBI to be perceived by a foreign counterparty or a credit rating agency as an individual institution, for it to be AAA rated, it has to invest in a lot of cash on its balance sheet, hold dollar assets, which will appreciate in value when rupee is depreciating, so that no one has any question mark ever about the RBI balance sheet. So basically, to cut a long story short, what the RBI has to do as an institution every year is that they figure out how much profits we made this year, how much provisions we have saved from past years to shore up the strength of our balance sheet. It goes through an internal stress test of a domestic banking crisis, an external rupee crisis. And it says, in spite of these crises, how can I ensure that a S&P or a Moody's will continue to think that RBI is AAA rated, even though the country is BBB rated? Then we say, okay, to ensure that we have to put some more provisions into the balance sheet instead of transferring it to the US government. And then it gets, the balance is what is called as the dividend distribution to the government. Now, sometimes RBI makes a lot of profits because, US interest rates last year were very high. So the dollar assets of RBI earned a lot of interest income. Those could be dispersed. Sometimes RBI is buying dollars when the rupee exchange rate is low and it's selling them when the rupee exchange rate is high. So in the process, it makes a little bit of money. And then, of course, it makes some senior edge money by just printing money, which is used as, printing money in an electronic sense. So it's expanding the rupee stock of reserves in the economy. It doesn't have to pay necessarily a high interest rate on that. So, all of these factors combine into generating sometimes high profits, sometimes low profits. And then that determines the size of the payout to the government. But I think what I want to explain is what I want everyone to take away home, if possible, is that we cannot function like the Fed in the US, because the US sovereign credit rating and the US dollar's reserve currency status are both privileges for the Fed that don't exist for the Reserve Bank of India. So Reserve Bank of India has to work on its own to shore up its balance sheet to be of a high quality strength. And it's actually a strength for the government. As I was saying, putting Shivaji's fortress on a high hill is a strength for all of the kingdom, not just for those who are inside, because if you can defend the enemy invasion and repel it, the entire kingdom will flourish for a longer period of time. So the same way, if you can keep currency attacks at bay or defend against the currency attacks, the entire country, including the current government, is better off by actually putting RBI in terms of financial security on a very high pedestal.
Great. Amazing insight and sort of way of thinking. Definitely sort of changes the approach in terms of how you would answer that question. As a layman. As a follow-through question, and maybe the last one on specifically on India for the time being. Can India afford an independent monetary policy? I know your standard answer as deputy governor. What will happen to FX? What will happen to the monetary policy? Will it be independent and so on? But as an sort of a bystander now, in terms of focusing on all the data right now and knowing like emerging economies do get impacted in a meaningful fashion, and we've had conversations, you and I as well personally, sometime back on this. I don't know if you recall that. Will India ever be able to, or do you think that sort of situation is coming where India will have a monetary policy which is independent of the global developed markets? And any sense, again, not asking for a view on rupee, but then any sense in terms of what happens to countries' FX market, maybe INR in India's case, when the monetary policy becomes independent of the global, shakeups and sort of global pulls and pushes of the monetary policy ecosystem.
So I would say there's sort of three layers of linkages that are important to think about. So, no country in today's world is an island unto itself unless you are like completely closed like North Korea or something, which fortunately is not the case for India. So, we get touched through foreign policies. What's happening to the tech sector in the US has a direct impact on tech jobs and venture capital financing, etc. in India. So there's no way in which you can avoid modeling global policy, global growth rates in understanding the inflation growth trade-off of India. So I would say whether one likes it or not, this is part of the modeling that one has to, the spillovers and the spillbacks are part of the modeling. Second, as I just explained, in case of India, I think we are now reaching a point. In my view, it is thanks to the inflation targeting that has been adopted over the last 8+ years in India, that the central bank, Reserve Bank of India, now actually has inflation credibility in the exchange rate markets. Even if government deficits are high, even if underlying inflation pressures are sometimes mounting, it is perceived that the inflation targeting framework will respond, keep inflation at bay, so the knob will be tightened in the offices of the central bank, interest rates will be raised, that will gradually slow down economic activity, and through that, it will bring the inflation down. So we are not seeing the scale of currency fluctuations that we were used to seeing until about 10 years back. We used to have runaway inflation and then a runaway currency depreciation. And so when fiscal deficits would rise, immediately the market expectation would be, oh, the central bank will contribute by allowing inflation to run away, by keeping interest rates low to help the government roll over its debt. That dynamic is not the dynamic in investors' mind anymore. The dynamic in investors' mind is, oh, where is RBI's target? How soon will they respond to this inflation surge? And when will the response of the economy to RBI's interest rate hikes bring the inflation down? That is credibility. That is what is inflation credibility. That then keeps the rupee stable in the external markets on top of everything. So I think that dynamic has happened, but we are not, I would say, like 100% there yet. We are not like a safe haven currency of the world. People are not investing in us in a big way, partly because we are not there yet. We are not allowing the rest of the world to invest in a big way in our markets either, especially in the bond markets, because if that money flows out, that could lead to a big disruption in the cost of capital of Indian companies. So what that means is we have to still keep guarding against these hot money flows. And the hot money flows are very much a function of the US interest rate policy. So when Fed pumps in a lot of dollars, lowers interest rates, immediately they start seeking out higher yields in emerging market currency. So our equities, our bonds start getting a little bit of froth at that point of time. And that froth then gets unraveled or pulled back when the US starts withdrawing dollars or starts raising the interest rates. Very often the two are coincident, a few months here and there. So the RBI has to keep responding to this external dynamic of hot money flows, the gap between the RBI interest rates and the US interest rates. They are part of some of the models that are in place at RBI as to how will these gaps play out in terms of future economic activity, future inflation, and so on. So I would say these are the three important challenges: direct growth linkages, the need for the RBI to maintain inflation credibility, because that is what drives the exchange rate stability. And third, worrying about the hot money flows moving cyclically up and down with the Federal Reserve interest rate. So to me, these are the three key factors why the Indian monetary policy is not entirely divorced from what's happening in the rest of the world. But I think, in my view, Reserve Bank of India deserves a lot of kudos, both from periods before us, during our time, after us, which is that institutionally, RBI has been quite conservative in opening up the taps of foreign money to come into India. In equities, we allow them to come because equity capital is anyway very risk-bearing. But on fixed income capital, where value stays very flat, and so the tendency would be to put in a lot of money and at the first sign of trouble, pull it out. The Reserve Bank of India has been very conservative, and I think it has managed external sector stability of India very, very well since early 90s, barring maybe one or two episodes here and there.
Great. That again sort of offers a lot of perspective. Thank you for that. Now sort of taking the lens away from India and sort of training it on the world. Maybe if you could highlight three sort of major trends or more if you have in mind which are at play, and maybe also because there's so much confusion in some of these indicators and how things are potentially going to play out. If you can highlight your confidence around what confidence interval are you playing around with, in each of these trends that you see, it will be sort of amazing to have that insight.
Yeah, I think it's sort of a very, at some level, it's a bit, it seems like a slightly different actually right now for the global economy because, US debt is technically, if you just kept projecting from the way the US deficits and debt trajectory is building up, it's unsustainable. So some correction has to come either through reduction in spending, increase in tax collections, perhaps both in the United States at some point of time. But the trouble with these is that it's a political decision and it could swing very wildly based on which government comes to power. And of course, we have an election coming up in a few months' time. I worry a little bit, leaving aside sort of any sort of political views on this, but just from a purely economic standpoint, we had an example of this in the UK where the Liz Truss government came into power in September 22, and they announced this mini budget where they basically said, listen, we will keep our deficits, but we'll collect fewer taxes. And immediately the bond market went into a complete dizzy. And then there was a spillover of the repricing in the bond market onto the pension fund positions. And then there was a doom loop sort of between owners of bonds and the pricing of the bonds. It's very hard to predict. If you ask anyone, would they have predicted 3 or 6 months before this happening in the UK, that UK could have had this sort of an episode? I think most people would have attached a very low probability to that outcome. And I think it goes back to an earlier observation I had, which is that many developed countries now can have the kind of fragility that typically we used to associate with only with emerging markets. To me, that UK episode was a little bit like an emerging market episode, if you ask me honestly. So I think I'm a bit worried about the debt situation in the US, and I think a populist government coming out and saying, oh, we are giving a whole ton of tax breaks to the rich. I don't know how the bond market vigilantes would respond to that. I think it's anybody's guess. So that's one. Second, I would say is more like an episodic risk of like an acute shock, like a bond market repricing can possibly be a very acute shock, because if you observe the US government borrowing, it's rolling over a lot of its debt with very short-term treasury bills right now. So right now, if there's a repricing in the bond market, that's a bit of a gap move. I think it could put a lot of short-term cash flow pressure on the US government. Second, but at a longer horizon, I think the risk to me is this geopolitical fragmentation that is happening. In my view, I think the world sort of corners China at its own risks, in my view. It's a very large country. Chinese consumption is actually very crucial to big parts of the world economy, cars, metals, and various other parts of the. So to think that somehow by putting China into a corner and isolating from it, somehow we'll all be better off as a whole. I have serious doubts about that sort of a premise. Maybe in a relative sense, yes, but I don't see how it would certainly, for example, raise cost of certain goods, taking out such a huge supplier. Even if the supply chains just get rerouted, there'll be frictions along the way and so on. So I'm a bit worried that the insular, internal-looking views now, even in countries like US, which used to be like, we used to think of them as the bastions of free trade and globalization. I think they've blamed China for all the problems, but not credited China for the low inflation that the US has enjoyed for many years. I'm not saying China and its growth model was without faults, but there were benefits of allowing China to prosper, which is that you got low cost goods, and that kept inflation low. And if that's not the case, I think again, it means perhaps like a gap move, the world may have to structurally get used to a slightly higher inflation, in my view. And I don't know how developed world again adjusts to that because they are scrambling at one level on their debt policies and so on. And the third thing I would say is, I worry a little bit about the job situation that comes about from this insular attitude, which goes beyond just trade. It's also at the level of immigration policies, and the rhetoric that somehow allowing immigrants to come into the developed world is a source of problem. If anything, my sense it's a source of their strength because the demographics are of the right type in the emerging markets. Those are the populations that are growing. You need a rising population in order to sustain certain high levels of growth. US has so far done okay by following a relatively open immigration policy that keeps its population from like stagnating at just the local fertility levels. Europe is a good example where actually borders are not as open other than from within the Europe. And the fertility rates are coming down. So the demographic growth is not there. And I think that in itself is becoming a source of stagnation. So, but I worry about it also more at a humanitarian level. There's so many people in China, there's so many people in India. And, I don't like to think about economics through the lens of national borders. It's better to think about it through global markets. And if we start choking the pipeline of these employment markets, let me call it, if we start choking the plumbing of the global employment markets into these national borders, how do you create jobs for so many Chinese or so many Indians when, like take example of China right now, the growth rates from like double digit is slowing down to 2%, 3%. Now that creates a huge humanitarian challenge in terms of jobs. And, if instead of benefiting from that labor market arbitrage that it should create, if you now start choking the global employment pipes, I think that it could lead to big humanitarian issues down the line in my view, because, when people don't have jobs, they do all kinds of crazy things in my view.
So, thank you for sharing all of that. Now, so can you maybe, paint a picture around, inflation? Because, honestly, when sort of the Trump regime started and we, whatever was in the sort of manifesto and whatever was promised, borders were going to be pulled up, and I thought that will lead to a good amount of inflation. In India, obviously, we had demonetization, which sort of, maybe changed some things, at that point in time. But I mean, globally, I thought maybe that was an era where, inflation would emerge, especially in the services sector. And it's been some time, and, US also played along with that trade to some extent, even after the regime changed on the geopolitical front. But, inflation being sort of, I understand it's a sort of, hypersensitive and very high frequency indicator, but then there's no spillover, especially on the services side as well. So can you please help us understand how some of these risks are not visible in inflation right now, despite trades being alive for a while?
Yeah, I think I would say the inflation as a whole has come down, but I think we should not ignore the fact that inflation was pretty high for parts of these last few years. And I think you have to look at cumulative inflation. The price level has shifted very high.
Yeah.
And that matters because usually wage growth doesn't keep pace with inflation in all jobs. So, for example, in my view, why is there a little bit of stress on the ground in India at the lower income segments, even though formal India is booming by any stretch of sort of calculation, is because actually, in IT sector, job wage growth was 15, 20, even 25%. Okay, so that's upwards of inflation. even if you are not in IT sector, if you are doing well enough, you had invested in the stock market and your financial rates of return far exceed the rate of inflation through the stock market valuations. But in contrast, at the low end of the income spectrum in the jobs, the real wage growth is negative over the last 3 or 4 years because inflation has been higher than the nominal wage growth in these parts of the Indian economy. What that means is it puts a little bit of a slowdown on the domestic consumption.
Yeah.
And I think to me, that's not getting as much discussion as it should. I think the wealthy are doing very well. A lot of their wealth then is recycling back into the luxury homes and the stock market. So then those are also doing very well in terms of pricing. But how much can the wealthy consume? Beyond a point, there's just limits to it. Okay, maybe every now and then there's a very expensive wedding or something like that on which a lot gets spent. But overall, you can't substitute for consumption of millions through consumption of a handful. You have to boost the consumption of the millions at the end of the day. And I think the fast-moving consumer goods companies' performance has actually been the laggard in the Indian story of the last few years. And to me, that all resonates with the fact that inflation cumulatively has actually eroded the purchasing power of the average Indian consumer, not necessarily the urban consumer or the wealthy Indian consumer. So to me, I would say that's all I want to say on inflation, that inflation is coming down, but we should not ignore the fact that its cumulative impact on savings and purchasing power is still playing out in the consumption. I think in the US, what has happened is that the services inflation is actually very high. So actually the low income jobs for a change have actually done very well. Labor is a bit scarce in the US. So actually workers have, at the low end have done relatively well. So US consumption, in contrast to India's, for example, is actually far more robust, even though it's also showing some signs of slowing down. I would feel much better about the overall Indian engine of growth if we were able to bring inflation down a little bit more in line with the wage growth of the lower income bracket of India, and indirectly then create a little bit more of a robust consumption at the lower end rather than just at the top end of wealth.
Amazing. So, thank you for sharing that. The way I am sort of reading that is pandemic masked the total impact of all these factors which were in play before the pandemic, and therefore the cumulative level of inflation is what needs to be looked at, and geopolitical concerns on inflation, the spillover of geopolitical risks and inflation are still something that is evident and may play out in the longer term. So I had just one quick question for you, Viral. We promised a particular timeline, 90 minutes. We are running a little slow on potential agenda items that we had discussed. Will it be okay for us to extend a little bit, if you're okay?
Yeah, that's fine. My recommendation would be that I see people dropping out, so maybe we can do justice to their questions, if that makes sense. Maybe we can take some questions from the floor, or I see some have been put in the chat box, so I just
Yes.
feel they might leave feeling that their questions were not answered. So maybe I'll try and be a bit more brief and crisper rather than waxing eloquent.
Amazing. Thank you for your focus on our viewers as well. While answering all those questions, Viral, can I just request a couple of minutes to shortlist some of these questions for your attention, and maybe request you to maybe move to one other question that I had planned for you. If you could share maybe incidents from the history where macro indicators were looking similar, and I know you teach a course on financial history, and your slides are updated up till Silicon Valley Bank in the course. So, I mean, if you could just give us some perspective on when did the macro indicators look similar to the way they are looking today, maybe that will just help us, place things in order. And I'll shortly the questions while you answer.
Yeah, I'll focus more on the global economy because, India of last three and a half decades is, of course, not comparable because of the liberalization that was undertaken in 90s. But I think if you look at the debt to GDP levels of the largest advanced economies, notably the US, it basically looks on par with where they were with World War II, So it seems like that the combination of deficits after the global financial crisis in 07, 08, 10, 12 year of stimuluses after that, and then the COVID-based stimuluses, which were far more ginormous in some sense. But the combination of the two has put the US on a sort of debt to GDP path, which is looking close to where it was at the highest levels in some sense. And I think that's worrisome because that episode post World War. So what happens is when the debt levels are so high, there are a few ways to deal with it. Either you have to engage in austerity or you have to engage in high inflation to basically reduce the real debt that the government owes. So you are inflating the debt away, so to speak. Or you have to engage in financial repression, which is what India was doing for a big part in 70s and 80s, which is government debt is very large. You just tell banks that you have to keep buying government debt. So I put 100 rupees into my bank and more than 40 rupees is just going into buying government bonds without the bank having to privately allocated, because by fiat, the central bank says, oh, I have to repress the financial sector into helping the government roll over its debt. Of course, that chokes private sector growth because then loans are not available if the money has to just go into the government bonds, etc. So I would say historically, we are ripe for one of these three outcomes, which is either for austerity or inflation or repression. There is a fourth possibility, which I hope doesn't come to the table for some of the largest economies, which is a sovereign default. Historically, large country debts are not defaulted on because that would be very disruptive to global financial markets. Domestic banks would be under question from the bond markets as well. But that's a fourth thing that could also be put on the table. But usually when you have government debt to GDP that it's at these levels, it has to be brought down. And then one of these 3 or 4 mechanisms has to be put in place. And the last thing I would add there is that this doesn't happen. Whatever happens to bring those debt levels down, it can take a large amount of time. It can take a decade. It can take 2 decades. So there's a very nice book by Professor Barry Eichengreen from University of Berkeley in defense of public debt. But one of the things he documents is that when debt to GDP levels do rise, such as at the time of wars, to bring it down, it can take several decades. And to me, what that means for the developed world is, I think, worth imagining, worth thinking about, worth learning from past historical episodes. Actually.
Thank you, Virul. One of the questions that we have is, the de-dollarization trend right now, which is getting a lot of press, by the way, in India. Maybe not so much press as, focus on WhatsApp conversations right now, where we see a lot of emerging markets being very comfortable, trading away from dollar. The sort of, the way Russian dollar assets were treated also sort of, puts a lot of focus on this particular aspect for a lot of sovereign entities in terms of how they manage their global asset pool. So any thoughts in terms of what is the thought process in the US right now? What's really happening there? How do you see this trend sort of pan out?
Yeah, I think I would say there's sort of one 10-year plus trend, which is that after, in 2013-14, there was a little bit of a taper tantrum episode, which was that a lot of emerging markets had borrowed in dollars. Then Federal Reserve announced a reversal of its accommodative policy. Chairman Ben Bernanke said we'll do a taper of quantitative easing. And that created a little bit of a tantrum in emerging markets, including for India at that point. So what happened is in the 10 years since then, the emerging markets have started borrowing more in bonds which are denominated in their local currency rather than borrowing in a foreign currency denominated bond. So that has naturally reduced the need for the central banks to hold more dollar assets abroad because the economy is less vulnerable to dollar flows. So that's one reason why this dependence has been decreasing over the last 10 years as a whole. Post-COVID and maybe especially post the Russian invasion, there's a little bit of a strategic weaponization of the dollar that gets talked about. To the best of my knowledge, the numbers that Barry Eichengreen and others are putting together seem to suggest that any decline in official government and central bank holdings of US dollar assets is very, very tapering off very slowly. So while there's a lot of chatter about it, in terms of actual numbers, it's not reflecting a much bigger decline. To me, the chatter that should perhaps be the more important one is the debt situation of the US and the political risks associated with it that I was highlighting earlier. My sense is a shift away from dollar, like the way the bond vigilantes acted on the UK gilt market, maybe more in response to a fiscal salient event or a fiscal question mark, rather than it being about this weaponization of the dollar and so on. I think that may produce some slow overall decline over time, but that, to me, that's unlikely to destabilize dollar standing in the world, whereas a fiscal problem could produce far bigger rotation, and how exactly it'll play out, no one knows, because in our lifetimes, we have not experienced a shift from a reserve currency towards another one. That happened long back in a very different financial world, much less globalized world, and so.
Great. There is this other question which does not really sing to me. I'll just read out the question as is, and if I don't know if it's talking about a doomsday scenario or if it's sort of highlighting some research that you may have read about. It'll be good to know your thoughts, and if it does not sing, we can just move on. Vivek Joshi has asked, it is now said that in a few years, long cycles will hit the US or world, leading to a lot of disruption. He's highlighting 3 bullet points here. A is the quantitative 50 minus R cycle, Strauss-Hove 20 cross 4 years, 20 by 4 years, and Clio Dynamics. What is your view? Viral, you're on mute right now.
No, I was trying to look up the question. I don't follow the 3 parts. I understand the bigger question of the.
We'll just skip past, because I thought, maybe it was a theoretical question that only you could answer, and I don't
No,
want.
it means I think I broadly agree with this longer cycles point, though,
Right.
Responding to Mr. Vivek Joshi, that I think the levels of debt to GDP that are there right now, they cannot be addressed comfortably in a short amount of time. So there will be a sovereign debt induced cycle, but which path or which combination of paths arises between austerity, inflation, repression, and some bond market turmoil? What percentage of this we observe in the combo of that cycle playing out, we have to wait and see. It depends very heavily on the political decisions that the US government takes over the next decade and 2.
Amazing. So maybe one question that just came to me from a lot of questions that I'm reading here right now, and maybe I just thought let's take a pause in the entire conversation and ask Viral for his one big crazy amazing idea for India right now. And let me not call it amazing, but maybe a crazy idea for India that you have, where you think maybe it's a little out there, but then completely change the game, even if we sort of take some step in that direction. And how I'm defining a crazy idea as demonetization, completely out there. Something along those lines. So is there anything that completely changes the game for India? And yeah.
No, by and large, I tend to be a very conservative economist. So I'm generally not in favor of taking big risks with an economy, because you have to be a little bit modest about your own ability to influence outcomes. So it's better to, in my view, it's better to identify problems and find right solutions for each problem rather than trying to do what I call like a little bit of tukkagiri, like let me wave my magic wand and somehow everything will turn out fine. No, I think to me, we are still a very protectionist economy. I think we have done well in IT and in services and in the whatever part of the Indian ecosystem that Mitesh was explaining that relies on equity markets, because actually somehow that ecosystem has benefited a lot from knowledge transfer, financial transfer, and movement back and forth of companies and labor across the world. But in our brick and mortar industries, we still employ very high tariffs. We don't allow foreign goods to come in without very heavy tariffs. The fact that land cannot be sold and bought very easily by foreign companies in India who don't have know-how of how to navigate through the local corrupt municipal offices and bribe people and so on. It's a form of tax. It's basically saying, listen, you don't know, so come and partner with local companies. Otherwise, you really can't come and figure out how the Indian ecosystem works. So I feel that on all of these, we need to truly become more open. I think we are not an open economy. Our tariffs are very high. There's research which seems to suggest that this is how our textile sector lost out to Bangladesh and Vietnams of the world. Because we just don't allow import of raw materials that is needed to actually produce the textiles that we need to supply to the rest of the world at the right price. So to me, it's not a fantastic outcome. It's actually economics 101, that you need to actually have low tariffs so that imports can come in at the right price, and then you add value and supply it back as exports to the rest of the world. Our consumption engine, as I explained, is not doing as great right now. So it's better to benefit from the consumption engine of the rest of the world and export there as much as possible. I think the services sector, both in tech and non-tech services, has done very, very well on this front. But I yet struggle to find Indian products in the goods manufacturing that I have to use in New York that are produced in India. And I would love to be able to do that. But to do that, we need to not have local champions. We don't need local tigers. We need our Indian manufacturing companies to become global tigers. Unless we allow them to compete on a level footing with foreign companies, they will remain protected, and then they don't need to produce the best products that the rest of the world wants to consume. So I'm very happy about all the Indian businessmen who are doing fantastically well in our traditional industries. Few of them are in the top wealthiest individuals of the world. But I think for that to translate into more jobs in India and jobs of the quantity that India requires, in my view, they need to make much more investment than they are making right now. For that, there needs to be more competition. And firms of that scale will face competition only if we open our borders to foreign firms that are of similar scale to compete with them. But right now, they are all in a very cozy space. The concentration that they have in the Indian industry is very, very high as per my research. And that means that investment and consumption are not as high as they could be, because we have kind of protected the incumbents rather than actually embracing foreign competition and realizing that ultimately it will raise the quality of goods that Indians produce, even if there's a little bit of upheaval along the way. But then we'll start producing for the entire global market rather than just for the Indian market.
Thank you. So one question I had, and it's been lingering for a while, considering the way forecasts have behaved, the way economies have behaved, and so on. And in your thoughts that you've shared, I do sense that you have a lot more comfort in the sort of long-term models which are visible, and given your study of history over the long term, I mean, you find comfort that some of these things may play out over a longer period of time. We need not steer away from the direction. But too much fiscal prudence is being preached to India. The rating is what it is, and if you sort of compare to other stories which have sort of changed the game right now, say the way China changed the game, or say where the South Korea story played out right now. Sometimes I do feel a lot of traditional theory and economic thought process which is being applied to emerging markets is to the detriment of these markets, and each sort of cycle is different, each scenario is different, and maybe they need to be a lot more independent and do what they or play the game sort of played by the ear, not really have too much reliance on these long-term models at some point in time. Because I honestly, whatever little research I have sort of focused on, I could not find evidence that just by being fiscally prudent for a very long time, all these developed countries became developed, or the countries which have sort of transitioned to a higher per capita have been able to sort of do that. So any thoughts there? Maybe I'm missing some data points. Maybe there are stories that I don't know of countries that I have not heard.
I'm actually saying something orthogonal, which is that in my view, the solution is not for the government to try and do everything. It's not about government spending more money. I think for an amount of money the government spends, I think it's better to spend it on infrastructure than freebies and subsidies. But what happens is when your policies are not reaching the last mile, it becomes very hard to take away the subsidies and the revenue expenditures, because how do you justify on the one hand a lack of jobs at the last mile and simultaneously taking away actually the freebies that out, at least politically, that might be equivalent of suicide for the party. So I think to me that we have to unlock, I think, private investment growth. I think we have not been able to do that. I think this government has done a good job of optimizing on delivery of welfare on the back of Aadhaar, UPI, and direct benefit transfers. As a result of that, overall welfareism has grown without necessarily expanding government deficits, because you've reduced the leakage. That has also allowed the government, partly through better tax collections, to spend more on infrastructure, on highways, roads, etc. But yet simultaneously, somehow, while there are some green shoots here and there, private investment, private consumption is not growing as fast as it would. So if you looked at the GDP numbers, taking out the government spending, I think it would look a little softer. So therefore, I think we have to ask the question, like, why not actually also allow greater competition, greater investment, which will also, in my view, reduce actually prices of goods and markups in the Indian economy, and that can also contribute to boosting consumption. So, in fact, I would say that we don't need to increase our current deficits. We can reorient more towards capital expenditure, even more than the government has done towards capital expenditures away from revenue expenditures. But to do that, we need to be able to create more jobs. To create more jobs, we need to be able to partake in the global growth engine rather than just the Indian growth engine. To do that, I think we need more investments, more production, etc. in India. And I think that opening up the economy further in sectors where we have kept it closed through high tariffs may actually be a solution that doesn't require doing something about the fiscal situation of the country at all, in my view. So in some sense, what I'm proposing is a bit orthogonal to saying government should do more or less. It's saying government should just open up the economy, and that itself will enable the private sector to compete and then get greater investments going.
So, listening to one of your talks maybe a year back, I did sort of, see your potential wild idea as being, government should get out of impacting prices in, all the other markets, apart from infrastructure, health, and education. And you wanted all the firepower to be sort of focused on these three items. So that is how I interpreted it. And you thought that's the, highest impact, these are the highest impact sectors for the, best outcomes right now. Any thoughts there in terms of how that can be executed in the Indian context? I mean, I understand, what it would require, but any maybe a couple of bullet points that you think will help us.
Maybe I can just focus on education a little bit, which is I do feel that I think we can devote far more to, I think, so let me first explain the education challenge, which is clearly we need to spend a lot more on education than we do right now. We are spending more on infrastructure. We have started spending on health, in my view, but we are budget after budget, we are not expanding our education outlay that much. The reason to spend on health, education, and infrastructure is that these are public goods, and at least the basic economic theory says that that is what a government should try to do. A government should not try to provide private goods like subsidized fertilizers or subsidize other kinds of stuff. Now, I think the challenge is that, in my view, there's a little bit of a catch-22 here, which is that as long as you keep farming industry very, very heavily subsidized in India, you don't get labor of the agricultural sector. And if you don't get labor of the agricultural sector, you might say, okay, how do you actually, how does it become apparent that we can create more jobs in the higher skill sense? So India's value add in agriculture is very low per person. We have over 40% of the working population doing what is now less than 20% of the GDP of the country. And I think it's sort of artificially large because we just have too many subsidies, right? From power, water, fertilizers, all the way to the final pricing of the farmer's output. And I'm not saying it's an easy to solve problem, but some of these things have to work together to ensure that we wean labor of agriculture into services and manufacturing.
Great. So I like that you sort of focused on education, and I had a follow-up question on the education front. So I have so far steered away even from the audience SS questions on the politically maybe influenced or motivated, or whether there was any kind of shade of political you know uh, intent, or some kind of element of being solution being political in nature. I've not gotten into those questions. But there is this thing on education where the last mile delivery in education in India, especially the higher education segment, the delivery is skewed, because of policies such as reservation. You also have affirmative action in US in some sense that plays out. And I'm not getting into the social context. Is it necessary or not necessary? And it is what it is, and our society sort of is voting for it. Is how I see it. So I don't mind it. But do you have any sort of economic research of directing not just this entire thrust of education is being going in the right direction, but actually a large part of it, maybe almost 30-40%, 50% is focused using parameters or directed using parameters which do not influence outcomes in a direct fashion, to my mind. So any thoughts there, any research there?
Yeah, I think my sense is that we have done better in creating educational institutions, maybe even creating far too many of them, not necessarily keeping quality control at the higher end of the adult education. But I think on pre-primary, primary, secondary, high school education, I'm not sure we have still kind of hit the right path. So there's a lot of work showing in the US that basically creating charter schools, and I'll maybe that's a good way to end the conversation because it'll circle back to IIT. Like, in a way, what did government do with IITs? It said, listen, I will create these pockets of excellence in small quantities, but very open entry, come in through an entrance exam process. And that creates a whole wave in the entire country of human capital preparing itself to get into IITs. Even those who don't get into IITs, clearly those who are just off the admission point have actually prepared well. They are, for whatever reason, they missed out on a few points here and there. Wherever they go, they are now already better trained. So I think one has to keep in mind that actually these apex highest quality educational institutions, they are serving a useful role, not just actually for the students that they actually train, but in creating this little bit of a tournament or a race to the top in education that comes along the way. And I would love to see something like the model of US charter schools. So basically what they do is they charter a bunch of municipal schools outside of the local municipal charter. So these charter schools can pay their teachers more flexibly than you can pay salaries in a municipal school. But the whole idea is that they are supposed to be delivering like the highest quality education. So for example, in New York City, there are, depending on how you count them, 8 to 10 sort of these high schools for grades 9 to 12. which are basically under the state charter. So they are not bound by the city's salary constraints, etc. They have the best of the teachers. Some of them focus on science and technology, some on music, some on arts. And they are spread out in different parts of the city. And it creates this tremendous middle school high quality preparation, because you have to take an entrance exam at the level of ninth grade to get into these schools. And the numbers are relatively large, even though New York City, of course, has a very large population, though it kind of doesn't look large when you compare it to Mumbai or Delhi or Chennai or something. And there is research that these schools actually have a huge impact on those who get in. And it doesn't matter at what rank they get in. And it doesn't matter even if they get into the best of these schools. Like whoever gets into any of these charter schools then has like a multiplier in their career outcomes from them on. And my sense is what we have done at the level of IITs, IIMs, we need to do it at actually now a lower tier. We need to do it at the 8th grade, maybe at the 5th grade. We need to create high quality education institutions, keep it open admissions, and create a little bit of a virtuous cycle so that everyone, what's really fascinating about like what I've learned through Pratham, the education NGO that I've been associated with, is that unlike in many other parts of the world, it's great news that most people in India, regardless of their income, think that education is the ticket out of poverty. They really want their kids to be educated. Even in the deepest slum areas of Mumbai, actually the parents' first hope for the child is that my child will actually study well and come out of where we are. Then if things don't work out for some reason down the line, they think the child is wasting time, then they might start employing them into something vocational or something else locally, taking them out of the school and so on. But given that that drive is there at the last mile, even in the poorest households, it suggests to me that actually if we created institutions like IIT at 5th grade, 8th grade, actually we will be able to identify the real talent which is out there, even in actually the hinterlands and the low income brackets, because there's no reason to believe that the bright minds are correlated with the wealth of the parents. That's somehow, it's as a theorem, that's got not to be the case. Of course, nurture will make a difference, but the nature part of it is going to be available. The raw material should be available in all parts of India, not just in the wealthier families. And so to me, that's like a tangible solution. It requires a slightly different approach than to say we will give a base level education to everyone. It says that no, we will create an aspiration in the primary and the secondary education of academic excellence so that you have a shot at this slightly higher quality education institutions that is out there. I think it has clearly worked well for the country on IITs, IIMs, etc. I don't see why it won't work well if we do it on a war footing at the middle school and high school education in India.
Amazing. So Virul, now I would like to move to a rapid fire mode where
Okay.
maybe some of the areas are where you've done a lot of work already. Maybe you can just highlight quickly maybe 3 bullet points for each question, and give us some perspective in terms of how we are thinking and looking at the world right now. So, what are the 3 biggest risks for India and the India story at this point in time? 45 seconds.
First risk, I would say lack of jobs at the last mile. Second risk, I would say populist policies to address that rather than actually address the problem on first principles. And third risk to me, risk to India, is the global risk of US debt and geopolitics.
Great. So, again, maybe stretching around the same chord, which risks are the most mispriced in the world right now, according to you? And, where, the focus is the least and which could sort of, explode and demand attention in the near future?
Yeah, I would probably put the same two risks. I think the risk of the US debt, and second, the geopolitical risks, because it's hard to price them. They are more like peso problems rather than something that are very visible and transparently play out. I think the third risk that is perhaps also not priced because it's really a little bit down the line, though maybe it's not even down the line, is probably climate change. I still think we are not pricing climate risk as powerfully as it should, partly because it's linked to policy. But I think the kind of temperatures we are seeing in the summers, we didn't talk about working conditions for laborers in India in the summers, but they've clearly gotten much worse over the last 4 or 5 years with temperatures hitting 50 degrees Celsius in many cases.
Great. Three, sort of guidance or sort of, bullets that you sort of keep in mind while managing your personal portfolio, personal finance, guidance for maybe all the IIT alumni here. How do you think about money?
Yeah, so by and large, I don't try to make money, which may come surprising from a Gujarati, but I like to do what I like to do, which is to do research and listen to music and watch sports or play sports. But whatever savings we have, so second answer is we just do try to hold like a global market. And I just do dollar averaging. So we just allocate a part of the savings mechanically month after month into a global portfolio of equities, commodities, bonds, inflation protected securities, etc. And third, I would say, therefore, the only way you can do this kind of mechanical strategies is that you have to not look at the performance of your portfolio every day. Because if you try to track your portfolio every day, there's always someone else who is doing better than you, and then you start rebalancing. So it's a little bit of a question of what gives you value and mental peace. I focus more on investing in myself, be it health or sports or etc. Or my work. But if financial investments is really your calling, of course you can't follow my strategy. Then you have to look for opportunities every day. But so my strategy is good for someone who wants to sleep peacefully at night, in spite of being relatively in the lower income bracket of, let's say, the world. Because happiness and wealth are not always correlated. So.
Maybe a little bit of a personal highlight here. I've also, after selling performance for maybe 2 decades, I've gotten into a mode of selling peace of mind and happiness to my investors.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the personal journey I'm on.
Maybe all roads come down to dollar averaging and just investing in the market.
Right.
Of course, you may miss the booms, like last 4 years in India. I'm very happy for all the investors who have made the money, but that's not for me.
No, but again, when you look at a 20-25 year performance, I think all of this averages out. I mean, so
exactly.
that's something you highlighted.
And it's the power of compounding, right? If you earn 4-5% every year, that's pretty good over a long period of time. So yeah.
3 bullet points for entrepreneurs here. How do you think they need to play this, global macro, the India story, everything that comes with it?
No, I would say, I think, especially in digital and fintech in India, I think the potential is very, very high. So I would put particular stress on that sector. Second, I think some of my IIT friends are increasingly looking at med tech in India, like med technology applications in the medical space. I think my sense is the potential there is likely to be very, very unbounded in my view. So maybe that's also another very interesting space. And the third thing I would say for all entrepreneurs is I think it's great that the new generation of Indian entrepreneurs is also producing products for the Indian consumer. But I think it'll be great if we start producing things that the rest of the world also actually ultimately buys, because I think we need to serve the consumption engine of the whole world and not just of India to be able to create the jobs we need for our demography.
Great. Now, 3 bullet points from your actual, sort of all the research work that you've been doing. A lot of it is already available in press, so I'm sure our viewers can go and sort of, access that. But maybe if you could just give us the inferences drawn or conclusions from your research on concentration risk, from the real economy, financial market disconnect, rural-urban disconnect, and so on. Just a quick, inferences that you've drawn and maybe thoughts for India around that.
Yeah, maybe I'll just base it on my current research because otherwise we'll spend another 2 more hours sitting. I would say based on current research, first focus not just on stock market performance of a country, but focus on the real economy performance as well. Focus on job creation, average consumption, incomes at the last mile. I think very often, whether we like it or not, that is what politics becomes about. It's about the average person, not actually the upper tail. So in one way or the other, it comes back to haunt a country if the last mile development is not good. So that's one. Second, I would say, I think reforms should be not for the incumbents. The reforms should be for markets. And what that means is it should be for entry, it should be for competition, it should be for free creation of enterprise and opportunity. And I think sometimes we confuse creation of wealth for existing companies with creation of opportunities in a free sense for everyone in an industry. I would say number two. And third, I would say banking sector and central bank are, in one way or the other, they are the lifeblood of an economy. They are the arteries which are performing the key functions. We never think about them on a day-to-day basis, but when there's a crisis, it's very, very important that they perform well. So countries that ignore the health of the banking sector, countries that don't allow central banks to develop as a powerful institution, in the end, they lose out because they are not building the fortresses that will guard them in the most difficult states of the world. And if I could just say here, in my view, just like IITs, like the way I have tremendous respect and gratitude to IIT Bombay in particular, I think I would be remiss if I didn't say what a great institution Reserve Bank of India is. In my experience, it has been built over decades by the various governors who have, I think, instilled in it not just a level of professionalism, but a level of work ethic and integrity, which was so refreshing to me when I joined the RBI from India, from New York. And it's really, I think it has played a huge role in India's development. I don't want to put all the credit on the Reserve Bank of India only. Clearly, liberalization reforms, the whole digital India technology that has been developed on the back of Aadhaar, all of this have also catapulted the Indian potential massively. But I would say, as an institution that lives beyond the term of any government and is like serving a very useful long-term purpose, I think Reserve Bank of India is one of the key architects of modern India, in my view. So, of course, I'm closer to RBI than other institutions. So I'm not sort of faulting other institutions when I'm crediting RBI, but I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge what a great institution it has been for India.
Great. Just one area of personal interest and maybe relevant to all of us. On climate risk, personally, I have been short the entire ESG thought process, depending on private corporates to deliver social good. What's your worldview right now? I'm sure the research and cutting edge work is happening there, but then where are we today in terms of thought process there? And maybe
you mean on CSR? Did you say? Or?
Not just CSR, the ESG, the thought process
Oh,
where you have
see.
ESG-oriented benefits to corporates, but then that, we have greenwashing, we have multiple incidents where it's not really played out and climate outcomes are not improving. So what is your thought?
Yeah, I think in my own view, I think these large institutional investors can play an important role. I think they are getting commitments out of large companies to being net zero by certain time points. And I think if those commitments are credible and they can be enforced, then I think that's sort of like a good process to put in place. And I think one second point here I would say is that everyone thinks about climate transition as mostly about reducing emissions, but it's also simultaneously about green innovation. It's about figuring out newer sources of energy and newer methods of production. And once you get the net zero commitments from the large companies, they basically start innovating. And then their innovations have spillovers beyond their own immediate applications. It's like once you start patenting a good algorithm, everyone else uses it. It's the same way that these green innovations are then having a lot of spillovers to others. So I think I think innovation is as important a part of this transition, in my view, as just cutting carbon emissions is. But the third thing I would say is that ultimately, if we lose the political will and capital to implementing climate change, ultimately it's an intergenerational problem. It's very hard for private entities to justify why they should be solving the problem if the governments, which are basically supposed to be borrowing against the full stream of long-term taxes and then using them to implement changes today, in my view, well-meaning governments, sufficiently visionary long-term governments, maybe with a little bit of complementary support from institutional investors, they are almost essential to make climate change work. If they drop the ball, I think we'll be getting hotter and hotter temperatures every summer.
Amazing. I think that topic itself deserves maybe another hour. So I'll maybe try it another time. You've been very, 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 very kind with your time. I have done some research and I could not find any YouTube interview that went on for 2 hours. So you've been super patient. Thank you very much for that.
There's a joke on this by a former RBI governor, Dr. Y.B. Reddy. He was a very witty person. He is still a very witty person.
Yes.
And he used to say when he used to give speeches that I don't need an introduction, I need a conclusion. So I'm sort of falling into his shoes as time goes by. Okay.
No, but
So good, very good to interact. Lovely
is
to
full,
be with so many IITians. I'm
yes,
sorry I
amazing.
can't interact one-on-one with all of you, but
Yes.
hopefully I'll be at IIT Bombay very soon. I understand
Yeah.
Hostel 6 is getting demolished very soon for a refurbishment.
Yes.
So I'm hoping to come back to see Hostel 6 sometime soon.
Great. Sorry, we're not done with you. I do need a couple of extra minutes, but I'll let you.
Yes.
Let you have a couple of sips. Just prepare. Imagine that orchestra behind you. Pull out the Kishore Kumar in you and give those maybe a couple of stanzas and so on. And while you prepare, I just thank the audience and everybody else here.
No. We should have a full singing session with band and everything. As I said, until I'm with band, I don't feel like Kishore Kumar. No. Let's do it another time, okay? Maybe I'll come to IIT and I'll sing at a Surba. So.
Amazing.
But
thank
in the meantime, you can listen to maybe some videos are online. I don't know. We'll see.
No. As I said, I did look for viral videos and viral Acharya videos.
Okay, good. So then your expectations are very low, and when I sing at Surbar, you'll be all pleasantly surprised.
No, amazing. I would also like to thank all of our viewers. They've been also very patient with their time. I'm sorry, I was a little you can say strict with the cutoffs on the questions, which sort of did not maybe cut the bar, managed to cross the bar with me. I did not sort of push them forward. I am more than happy to take them personally and liaise with Viral to sort of get some of these questions answered. A lot of these questions, by the way, his research and thought process is already out in the market. Viral is a long-term thinker, so a lot of these answers don't change over the years. So if you look back at his lectures and interviews, a lot of these answers are potentially there. Thank you again for all of you for your time, and Viral, thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, and thank you,
it was amazing,
for reaching out, and thank you to Mitesh as well for his excellent introduction. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Ashish. Bye.